Michael is the chief data scientist from Kenna Security. Michael is a recognized expert in cybersecurity data science. At Kenna Security, he is responsible for building the company's core analytic functionalities focused on security metrics, risk measurement, and vulnerability measurement. And his speech title for today is Inverting the Vulnerability Management Pyramid.
Excellent. So thanks everybody for coming. I am the chief data scientist of Kenna Security. I've been with Kenna since the beginning. I was the fifth employee. I've been around for 9 years now. But I'm not going to talk about Kenna Security. I'll try to make this one quick, about 15 minutes. I want to talk about the metadata that we see from our customers and some benchmarking data for you to take back home that you can use with your CIO, if you are the CIO or the CISO, that you can use back home. Essentially, what we do is vulnerability management, and specifically risk-based vulnerability management. We essentially have the patent on predicting exploits, and we have a prioritization score, but a lot of people do. That's not the point of this talk. The point is rather that we've got about 600 customers. Just about all of them are in the Global 2000. We've got 5 of the Fortune 50, 50 of the Fortune 500. And we did a benchmarking study across all of them, not about how they prioritize vulnerabilities, but rather about what it is that they remediate, which tickets they open in Jira and ServiceNow and BMC Remedy, and what they actually end up closing out, which vulnerabilities they remediate. And it turns out that from that data, we can learn a lot about how folks are doing vulnerability management, what their strategies, what their policies are. And we can also learn a lot about what they're doing wrong. So maybe 6, 7 charts is all I'll walk you through, but I think it'll give you a good view of what is common practice in vulnerability management and how we can get better. The underlying theme here is that I think we're doing it wrong. We're starting with sensors, with signal. We're looking at scanners like your Tenable, your Qualys, your Rapid7, which are invaluable scanners into finding which assets and vulnerabilities are in your network, but ultimately they're noise. You need to find the signal from that noise, and the signal is those vulnerabilities that you need to remediate. So let me show you what I mean. This is a chart of all 600 of our customers. We're looking at 2 years of data here from 2017 to 2019, and we're looking at all of the vulnerabilities that they observe in a given month, so everything they've scanned in, and in any given month, we're also looking at the number of vulnerabilities they remediated or closed out. And there's many ways to remediate a vulnerability. It could be a mitigating control, it could be a Microsoft patch, it could be removing the system from your network. That's a form of remediation. It could be a risk accepting that vulnerability even though it's still on the system. So this is mind-blowing because the chart, the line of best fit is so precise. The R squared here is 0.964. And what that really means is that it's very scale invariant. What do I mean by scale? On the x-axis, you've got the number of vulnerabilities that somebody sees in a given month. And you can see it's logarithmic. So on the left-hand side, 10,000 vulnerabilities in a given month. That's a pretty small organization. On the right-hand side, some of them are approaching 20, 30 million vulnerabilities. Those are your Fortune 10s, Fortune 20s. But regardless of how large your organization is, how many assets or vulnerabilities you have, the median organization can remediate about 10% of their vulnerabilities every month. And it's an incredibly scale invariant and very good fit. So what does that really mean? The best performers are maybe doing 20%, the worst performers are maybe doing 5%. But the fact that that range does not depend on size tells us that the problem has nothing to do with your vulnerability management team or the process you have in place, but probably has a lot more to do with some scale invariant capacity constraint of the actual systems, the vulnerabilities themselves, perhaps even the vendors. If you've got 10% capacity, you would think that's not enough, right? Most folks have SLAs of 30, 60, 90. High and critical in CVSS is about 40% of all the vulnerabilities that are out there. Actually, for our customers, it's about 55%. If you're trying to remediate 55% of your vulnerabilities, 10% is not enough. But our contention is that you don't need to. So this is the opposite view. This is the defender view. What I showed you before was the defender view. This is the attacker view. Of all the vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database, which is what this rectangle represents, 164,000 CVEs, 77% of CVEs have no published or observed exploit. What that really means is that perhaps there's a 0-day for them, but probably not. There's nothing public. There's nothing in the Black Hat exploit kits. There's nothing that we've seen tied to a successful exploitation, which means that about 80% of those vulnerabilities have a very low probability of actually being exploited in the wild. And this checks out. This is a standard Pareto distribution, a standard power law. It turns out that 21.2% of them have an exploit available on GitHub and Metasploit and Contagion exploit kits. black hole or angular, any of those, when you look historically over the past 10 years, only about 20% have an exploit. Now, an exploit doesn't mean that anything's going to happen. It means that the potential for exploitation exists. It turns out that only about 1.8%, and no matter how you slice it, it's about 1 to 2% of vulnerabilities, are ever exploited in the wild, or ever actually used in successful compromise. This 1 to 2%, is actually what has a probability of exploitation, what poses a risk to your organization. So if it's only 1 to 2%, perhaps 10% is more than enough if we just target the right things. You cast your net over that 1 to 2 that you know about. You get very precise about knowing a probability, maybe using machine learning to figure out what the 10% net you need to cast is to make sure that you capture all of that 1 to 2%. But that's not possible in today's data flow. Today's vulnerability management starts with the noise, moves to intelligence, and some of that intelligence is you yourself analyzing a scan. Some of that intelligence is, the experts that we're talking about at Microsoft, maybe buying some third-party services. But ultimately, every time you cut a ticket, every time you cut a Jira ticket or a ServiceNow ticket, you're making a prioritization decision. You're saying somebody has to go out and do that. And if you're making that decision for 50% of the vulnerabilities that are out there, it's unlikely you can use your capacity effectively. That's why the backlog is growing. So there's a better way, but we're going to get there by looking at what it is that folks are actually doing. So I told you 600 customers, but not all of them agreed to the benchmarking study. 110 opted into going deeper, into us actually looking at their vulnerability and scan data, not just what was closed and what was open. And when we did that, we looked at two metrics. I actually have marketing made these slides for me, so I gave them the charts and they made them fancier. All right, so check it out. If you use a metric like accuracy to measure vulnerability management, not a lot is going to happen. Accuracy is a terrible metric in the face of rare events. Think about things like vaccine efficacy. We don't use how accurate is the vaccine at capturing the virus. We use things like efficiency, or things like how much of the virus did it prevent. Similarly, with vulnerability management and most machine learning, there's two measures we use. We use precision and recall. Here's why accuracy doesn't work. If you've got 100 machines, and every morning you wake up and you walk into the CISO's office and you say, we're all good, we're totally secure, there's never been a compromise, but one of those machines was compromised, you have a 99% accuracy. But that doesn't do much for the business because you've been compromised, right? That accuracy doesn't mean much when the event is very rare. And so we use things like efficiency and coverage, or precision and recall. Efficiency means if you remediate 10 vulnerabilities, what percentage of those vulnerabilities actually posed a risk to your organization? What percentage of those vulnerabilities were ones that had an exploit or a successful exploitation tied to them? And it turns out when we look at those 110 customers, there's normal distribution in the spread of their efficiency, but about 40% on median are efficient choices. That means 6 out of every 10 vulnerabilities we choose to remediate does not pose a risk to your organization. Let me say that again. 60% of the work we do in vulnerability management does not reduce risk for the organization. And that's because we're cutting tickets just because the vulnerability exists, or because we think that a high CVSS score is indicative of actual risk, which it is not. Now, efficiency by itself is not a good enough metric, because if 2 years ago I just remediated Bluekeep, then I was incredibly efficient. I fixed the vulnerability, and I know that that vulnerability caused compromise elsewhere. But that's just one vulnerability out of maybe 10 million that my organization has. And so I didn't really reduce risk for the business. That's why the second metric comes in. Coverage, or recall, actually measures, of all of the things that we know pose a risk to your organization, how many did your strategy capture? Let's say your strategy is we fix highs and criticals in CVSS. And let's say you fixed all of them. Unlikely, but let's assume we did. Then of all of the vulnerabilities we know have been successfully exploited or have an exploitation out there, how many did that strategy cover? And so that's what we're asking here. Of these 110 customers, looking at the vulnerabilities they remediate, did they get there? How many did they remediate that have exploits and exploitations? It's not a normal distribution, but it looks like the median is around 75 to 80% coverage. And this makes sense. We deal with the Global 2000. A lot of these organizations have high budgets, are targeting incredibly high coverage because they have a low risk tolerance, right? They have business critical services, or they have payment systems. Now, there's two clusters. There's this cluster, which are the large organizations shooting for 80% coverage. And there's another cluster here that's shooting for about 20-25% coverage, or attaining 20-25% coverage. But what's incredible is that regardless of the coverage they're shooting for, their efficiency stays the same. And just like that scale and variance chart we saw in the beginning, as a benchmark, this should tell you that the efficiency game is not a question of your risk tolerance, but is rather a question of your knowledge about vulnerabilities and your vulnerability intelligence. I'm going to skip the rest of it. But the idea behind tomorrow's data flow, or this isn't a product, this isn't something we sell, this is just what I think vulnerability management should look like, is actually a lot like the previous speaker was talking about. It's starting with intelligence about vulnerabilities and giving us forecasts. CVSS gives us a severity metric with 6 features, essentially, 6 descriptions of a vulnerability: authentication, integrity, access complexity, integrity impact, availability impact. Those are descriptions of the vulnerability. They do not describe the risk of the vulnerability. Just like rain is wet tells you about the rain, but the probability of the rain's occurrence is what we truly care about when looking at a forecast. So if we had forecasts for those vulnerabilities, we wouldn't use just scanners for that risk assessment. We would also use things like endpoint protection tools, IDS, third-party services. We could look up Tanium or OS Query just to check if the software that the vulnerability affects is running on your network without kicking off an invasive scan. We could check a CMDB. I know a lot of folks are now doing work in their ServiceNow instances to look at golden images of containers and check what software is running on them. And then instead of scanning those, you can just check if a vulnerability affects that software. You know you're running it. You know you're vulnerable. Let's do something about it. So leveraging all of your existing security investments becomes possible once you start with the top of the pyramid with the actual decision-making portion, rather than let's look at a bunch of spreadsheets, let's look at what the sensors are telling us, what do we do about these sensors? And that flip is only possible because we've been doing security for 20, 30 years. We now know how to build these models. We now know how to build a forecast model, whereas 20 years ago, we were struggling with figuring out where a vulnerability is. And you can see that very clearly when you look at the National Vulnerability Database. In the 2000s, about 1,000 vulnerabilities were published per year, and scanners were detecting maybe 20, 30% of these. In 2004, 2005, Steve Christie-Coley built an automated system and got a lot more funding at MITRE to publish a lot more CVEs. And around 2017, the Certified Numbering Authority methodology came out. So we had about, 6, 7 numbering authorities, Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, Apple, working throughout the past 2 decades. And today we have 170 different numbering authorities publishing vulnerabilities. If that is the reality we're faced with today, and this number is only going to go up, there's no way we can start with the vulnerabilities. We need to start with the forecasts and move onwards. Now, that's one takeaway that I've got for you from looking at the data. It's that efficiency is probably more important than coverage, and you can be more efficient by not just using scanners to do vulnerability management. Ultimately, vulnerability management is your most preventative control. It's addressing the risk before it actually gets exploited. But you can use all of your other systems in making those decisions as long as you start with the vulnerability decision and then see what of your sensors can detect it. But the second takeaway I have for you is going to be very interesting in discussion. It's actually about the vendors themselves. It's that we have these blanket policies. We have these SLAs about how often or how quickly we need to remediate vulnerabilities, some of which are met, some of which are not. But when we look at how folks actually remediate vulnerabilities, I've got 3 charts on this, and then I'll be done. We learned something about the reality of vulnerability management. This is a survival curve. It's the same thing you see for a cancer patient. What's the probability that they will survive further on? But here, I'm flipping the script on it a little, and I'm looking at the survival curve of a vulnerability. Of all the vulnerabilities that exist at time 0, none of them are remediated. It turns out that after the first month, and I'm looking at 18 billion vulnerabilities across 600 organizations, across 25 million assets here, it turns out that in the first month, 45% of vulnerabilities are remediated. That's your 30 SLA. It turns out that in the first 3 months, that's your 90 SLA, 2/3 of vulnerabilities are remediated. But what's much more interesting is how quickly we get there. The slope of this curve, the slope of the survival, tells us about how many vulnerabilities remain. And you can see this asymptotically, 20% of vulnerabilities are still open after the first year. All of this under the curve is opportunity for the attacker. It's times when they could exploit you before the vulnerability is covered. Now, if you're looking at all vulnerabilities, this is an impactful chart. This is a good benchmark. You want to be faster than this chart. It becomes much more interesting when we start breaking it up. When you break it up by platform, you see a very interesting thing about these vulnerabilities. Microsoft does better than anybody else. 36 days to remediate the median Microsoft vulnerability. In 36 days, 50% of Microsoft vulnerabilities are removed from the system. That's super fast. You see the slope of this line is quick. For Mac, it's about 70 days, twice as fast. For Linux Unix systems, it's 254 days to remediate 50% of vulnerabilities. Makes sense, they're much harder, right? Imagine upgrading an F5 device versus clicking deploy on a Microsoft patch. And kudos to Microsoft, they make it super easy to deploy those patches. Linux certainly doesn't. Look at appliances and devices here, almost a year to remediate 50% of them, and then they continue onwards, right? They persist. Some percentage of those vulnerabilities persists further on. What's interesting here is that about 15% of Microsoft platforms, more than a year out, a year and 6 months out, are still vulnerable to some vulnerabilities. Whereas Mac users tend to remediate all of them. They're forced into those updates, right? Whether they like it or not after some point. But what's interesting here is that if you have a 30-day SLA for your Linux Unix systems, and you have a 30-day SLA for your Windows systems, that 30-day SLA for Linux Unix is like 7 times faster than the median. You're doing amazing. But if you have a 30-day SLA for Microsoft platforms, you're just about average. So rethinking how we set risk tolerance decisions based on the platform and based on the benchmarks for those platforms is essential. If you want to be fast at Microsoft vulnerabilities, you want to do it in 14 days. If you want to be fast at Linux vulnerabilities, you don't need to sprint within the first 30. You can do it in 90, and you're still faster than the average. And this gets even more interesting when we start looking at supported or unsupported devices. Everything that's a dotted line here is unsupported. Everything that's a dashed line is recently unsupported. I apologize, I ran this chart in 2020 and haven't updated it since, so there's one more that's unsupported. But these charts are shifting out because once you lose support, you also lose the ability to be as blazing fast as Windows 10 or Windows 8.1 allows you to be. So we all know XP is out of band, but we still got ATMs running Windows XP. And it looks like after a year and 6 months, 80% of Windows XP vulnerabilities are still there. For example, for Microsoft Vista, it's unsupported, but much more recently so. After a year and 6 months, only 30% of vulnerabilities are still there. And look at the speed it takes to get there. For the supported systems, they're so close together. It looks like 70% of vulnerabilities remediated within the first 3 months, and more than 50% of vulnerabilities remediated in the first month. And so this is all about how easy does the vendor make it to remediate those vulnerabilities. Microsoft is particularly good at this, but that means that if they're particularly good at this and we still have successful exploitations on them, you need to set even more aggressive SLAs because they've made it easy for you. Conversely, systems that make it very difficult to remediate vulnerabilities, if you want to be faster than the bear, you don't need to do it within the SLAs that you've set. It's not a finger in the wind that you're waving here to determine that SLA. There's some data that allows you to set a benchmark for how aggressive your risk tolerance needs to be. So the two takeaways, the first one is efficiency, much more important than combing through every scan finding. The second one is it's not evenly distributed. It depends on the vendor, it depends on the software, it depends on your business context too. And then the last takeaway I want to leave you with is when we look at those 600 organizations, how many of them are reducing the number of high-risk vulnerabilities in their environment? And how many of them are just treading water or actually falling behind, getting more high-risk vulnerabilities month over month? And keep in mind, these are Kenna security customers, so all these people are sophisticated enough to not just buy a scanner, but also buy a risk-based vulnerability management program. This is not your average organization, and they're all in the Global 2000. So you're looking at 51% are reducing the number of high-risk vulnerabilities, 16% are treading water, and this is over a 2-year study period, and 33% are falling behind. So don't despair if you've got more vulnerabilities than the month before. Just make sure that you have less vulnerabilities with exploits and exploitations that are accessible, and you're already in the top 50% of organizations. That's it.